Trump approved a major disaster declaration for Alabama Tuesday, but poorer people relying on the government to help them rebuild are likely to be disappointed. An NPR investigation found that wealthier white Americans tend to receive more federal aid than minorities and those who are less well off. And disaster relief spending seems to be making wealth inequality worse. Robert Benincasa is an NPR investigations unit producer, and he joins me now from Washington. Robert, thanks so much for being with us. What did the NPR investigation find out about how federal funds for disaster relief are being distributed?
Well, Elaine, one of the things that we looked at were the buyouts that the federal government and local governments sometimes can do. If a house has been damaged by a disaster or a wildfire or a flood or something like that, sometimes the government will step in and buy it. And we looked at 40,000 of these buyouts. And we found out that most of them happened in places that are more than 85% white. So nationally, the context for this, nationally, the country is 62% white and non-Hispanic. So these buyouts were happening in places that were disproportionately white. And so why, right? So what's happening here, we think, is that this is mirroring the existing inequities in the economy. White households are more likely to have to own a home, to have the positive equity in the home. They can better tolerate the process of the buyout because it takes long, it's bureaucratic. They have more financial resources. So it's probably has to do with that. It's not that the government is deliberately targeting places by their demographics. It's more, we think, has to do with making structural inequities that are already in the economy worse.
Well, so could you just expound on that? I mean, how is it that these disasters actually exacerbate these problems of wealth inequality?
Well, if you're better positioned to take advantage of federal aid, maybe you have a bank account, maybe you can get time off of work to fill out the paperwork, maybe you know where to go, who to call, your situation can actually get better in the years following a disaster. We cited some research that found this, and if you're already starting out at a disadvantage, years after the disaster, your situation can get worse. And we reported on some researchers who found exactly that, that along the lines of race and education, that how someone does years after a disaster, there are some big differences there.
Well, and on that point, in your piece you highlight the stories of two families whose Houston homes were destroyed during Hurricane Harvey. One family is now financially stable while the other is facing bankruptcy. Tell us a little more about that.
Right. My reporting partner, Becky Hersher, went to Houston to report on those folks. You know, one guy, he was already doing pretty well, had a good job. His job gave him time off, gave him some extra money, and said, you know, take your time. And he was able to find another place to live. He's able to wait out the process to sell his home to the government. And the government buys these houses so that they aren't subject to disasters anymore. And he's, you know, he works for a big company. In the other case is a lady who works for the post office. And she, you know, she was able to get some help, but she wasn't able to qualify for a loan because her credit score wasn't good enough. And then there was another type of program that she actually made too much money for, so she wasn't able to get that. So their sort of paths diverged, and her living situation became more expensive. So that's the kind of thing that we kind of did our reporting to kind of illustrate that where you start out really can make a difference for where you end up when the government steps in to try to help your community if you've been subject to a disaster.
And you mentioned that even when disaster relief programs function as they are designed, there is still inequality. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the sort of the backdrop here is that climate change is driving more disasters. There's going to be more floods, more wildfires, and more communities affected. So the programs, like you said, if they're working as designed, they come in and people still have to apply for them. You have to have the resources to take advantage of these things. Homeowners, if you have a home and you have positive equity, you're better positioned to get something like a buyout. So it's not that the programs aren't functioning as designed. FEMA's buyout program, FEMA doesn't pick which homes get bought out. That happens on the local level. So yeah, so that you're right. You know, even when the programs function as they're designed, there are still going to be inequities that result. So, you know, in the future, policymakers, they may want to look at this and think about how these programs can result in a more equitable distribution.
Yeah, it would seem to be sort of a massive undertaking, though, when you talk about some of these systemic inequalities that exist. But what you're pointing out is that they do, and that perhaps they could inform what other kind of policy prescriptions lawmakers might try to pursue in the face of these disasters. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Right. We're reporters. We don't make those predictions, but we don't make those prescriptions, but the policymakers do.
Right. All right. Well, it's a fascinating piece. Robert Benincasa, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.